Welcome to Association Chat, where we warm ourselves by the virtual fire with topics of the day, welcoming thought leaders and trailblazers alike to join up in this online home for the community. We're home, we're here, we're excited. And now on to the show. In an age where we seem to have all the tech tools and all the channels available to do anything we want, most of us aren't reaching that Leonardo da Vinci level of creativity that we might have hoped to reach. We tell ourselves maybe we aren't that creative, maybe it's just not in our DNA. Well, our guest today, Allen Gannett, has been making the argument that we can all be more creative, and he has a good reason to think so. Allen has been the founder and CEO of TrackMaven, a marketing analytics platform whose clients included Microsoft, Marriott, Saks Fifth Avenue, Home Depot, Aetna, and GE. In 2018, it merged with Skyword, the leading content marketing platform. His book, The Creative Curve, which I'm happy to say I've had for a while now, and I love it, is the leading, his book, The Creative Curve, I Lost My Place, came out in 2018 from Penguin Random House. The book has been featured on CNBC, Forbes, numerous top podcasts, and today he's here with Association Chat. Most importantly, he was once a very pitiful runner-up on Wheel of Fortune. Have to dig into that. I won't need to buy a vowel to say that today. He's going to share the insights he's learned about our relationship with creativity. He's going to share about how we can develop moments of creative genius and even how it can connect to community. Okay. Allen.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Oh
that was a fun introduction.
I'm going to cut it out and because I totally. But you know what? I'm so glad you're here. I was super excited, and so I just had to rush to get to the point where I can ask you questions. So listen. There's so much that, and there's a little bit of an echo I'm hearing in the background. Here we go. Let's just check this. All right. There's so much that I wanted to ask you about with regard to the creative curve. And, one of the things is that, people think that if they weren't born creative, if they just don't have that sort of built into them, that it will never happen, that they're never going to have that sort of spark of creativity that's just not in their genes. And I want to ask you about the research behind it. But first, I want to ask you, so that we can provide a little background and context for people. Have you always considered yourself creative? I mean, what's your personal connection to creativity?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think that it depends on what our definition of creativity is and depends on what my personal definition has been. So if I look back at my life with the definition of creativity I have now, I think I was always creative. But the definition I have now of creativity is really that ability to create things that are both new and valuable. And that's a definition that we get from sociology. And the important thing there is not just about creating things that are new. You can create, I can throw paint on a canvas. It's certainly novel, but it's not valuable, right? People have done that forever. Jackson Pollock sort of nailed it. And then it's definitely not creative. Now, on the other side, if I look back to when I was young, I was, starting companies, I was doing, creative entrepreneurial projects, but I didn't think of myself as an artist. I didn't think of myself as a creative in that sort of sense. And I think for a lot of people, we get really hung up on that version of creativity, the arts, the culture version of creativity. And I think we're pretty hard on ourselves around restricting our use of creativity to have a broader definition. So yeah, when I was a kid, I definitely didn't view myself as a creative. In hindsight, I think I was.
It's so interesting. And so what got you to the point where you're the one that's talking about creativity to everyone? Because, how did you go from being the person who didn't consider themselves particularly creative to saying, here, everyone, here's how you can be creative?
Yeah, I mean, I think, part of it is I grew up in New Jersey and I get kind of frustrated, as most New Jerseyans do. And I realized that, I was talking to a lot of marketers when I was, running the business I used to run. And I heard a lot of marketers say, oh, I'm not that creative. Yeah. And I was like, marketing is definitely creative, right? That shouldn't even be a question. And I realized that more and more people I talk to, we have a lot of mental blocks around creativity. We think of creativity as something we either have or we don't, and most of us think we don't. And I started doing some research and reading about it. And what I found was that actually the research shows that creativity is pretty widely spread. And so I started talking about this. I gave some talks on it at conferences, and I found that it just really resonated with people on sort of an emotional level. And it got me motivated to really be like, okay, why is this such a not a widely known thing? And it just sort of snowballed into a longer talk, into a book proposal, into a book. And ultimately the book that came out of it, The Creative Curve, is really this look at the myths around creativity, the truth around creativity. And then I interviewed 25 living creative greats. These are Oscar winners, Tony Award winners, billionaires, Michelin star chefs, about the practice of creativity. So how, if we can get better at it, how do we actually do that?
Well, so do you ever get creator's block? Because if you had writer's block, for example, it would kind of suck, right? To have written The Creative Curve and then be like, I can't make myself do this. So does that ever happen?
Totally. But one of the things I'm a big believer in is that you have to sort of go with your own flow. So for me, for example, I found I can basically write for 2.5, 3 hours a day. And when I say write, I don't literally just mean write. I also mean editing, researching, putting together outlines for chapters. I can't do more than 3 hours a day. I just can't do it. And so I could either sit there for the remainder of the day and be sort of frustrated, or I can do other stuff. And so a lot of times the other stuff is maybe doing interviews for a book project, but a lot of times it's I do a lot of other things, right? I do things like this. I do a lot of startup investing. I have a lot of stuff going on. And partly that's just because I can't write for more than 3 hours a day. And I think for a lot of us, we have this notion that we mix up creativity with productivity, right? Mm-hmm. Creativity is not just about pumping it out. It's not about doing it. It's about getting the right idea at the right time and executing on that. So a big part of creativity is simply thinking and having the right idea. And you have to position yourself both from a sort of mental resources perspective, but also just a physical energy resources perspective to be able to pursue those ideas and actually execute on them.
Well, so, and that's something that I think everyone can sort of identify with, is even if they feel sort of a little bit creative, I think we all feel a little bit guilty that we're not able to produce more and do more with it. Why am I not Leonardo da Vinci? Why am I not, solving all kinds of equations and then, painting by the candlelight at night? I don't know. And so, one of the things that you talk about in The Creative Curve, you have these 4 laws for creativity. And one of them is community as being an important piece of, being creative, being productive I guess not productive, but being creative. And you talked a little bit about this idea of community as being such an important piece of that. Can you tell me why? What role does community play in a person's creativity?
Yeah, so we have this myth of creativity of being a very individualistic activity, right? And you can obviously think with a book cover, right? It's my name's on the cover of the book. But the thing is that, if we think about it for more than 10 seconds, well, obviously there's more people involved, right? There's the copy editors, there's the editors, there's assistants, there's research assistants, there's the marketing team, designers, there's people who laid out the book, there's people who worked on the sales channel distribution. There's a lot of people involved in a book. But it turns out that who we give credit to is very much a social phenomenon. So in books, we've decided it's the author. That's the only person that gets credit. But if you watch a movie, right, there's those long credit lines, right? Everyone gets credit.
Right.
In a Broadway show, we talk a lot about producers, but actually sort of big open secret is that other than the main producer, all the other producers in a Broadway show are basically just investors who put money in. And so they still win a Tony, even if, that they have no involvement in the show other than putting their money in, right? So these ideas are all social phenomenons. And so as a result, when you start to look at creativity from this social lens, what you start to realize is, okay, well, it's not just about me being able to do everything, right? As an author, I'm not expected to also be perfect at copy editing, be perfect at marketing. I'm not expected to design the cover of my own book. What you rather need to be good at is self-awareness. Right? How do you identify your weaknesses? And then how do you bring in other people or other resources to actually buttress those weaknesses and make you good at those things? So Steve Jobs, we all think of him as this wildly creative person who, sort of led Apple. It was all on his back, but he had Steve Wozniak on day one because he knew he wasn't technical enough. They raised venture capital money very early and hired multiple engineers. Like, he was not doing it all himself. Think about when the iPod came out, he had thousands of engineers. Like, this is not the story of one man tinkering in a garage. And so once you start to reframe it, you can start to realize that, okay, bringing other people into my creative orbit, building a creative community around myself, that is really essential to creative success. And all of the great stories of creative success involve that.
And we have a question. Do you think that creativity involves putting your heart and soul into your work?
Yes, I do. Mm-hmm. But I think that's true for anything, right? Any work you do that you want to be good at, I think you have to put your heart and soul into it. And so, I think creativity sometimes, I talk about this a lot in my book, a lot of the work for creativity happens in the right hemisphere of our brain. And the right hemisphere of our brain can be a little bit goofy. Like, it likes to solve problems, but it works sort of below our level of consciousness. And only once it gets the answer does it sort of say, hey, I got the answer. And the problem with that is that when we experience that sort of phenomenon of saying, hey, like, I got the answer, like, listen to me, we assume, because we don't actually experience all the unconscious work going on, we're like, oh, this was a magical, spiritual, mystical thing. And as a result, I think a lot of us actually use that as an excuse to not be more intentional with our creativity, because we're like, well, I'm either going to be struck by lightning or I'm not. And in reality, we know a lot about how you can actually nurture yourself to have more of those moments, more of those inspiration moments. You can actually get better at those.
Yeah. This is a great question that Heather asked. Do you strive to be unique in your creative endeavors? And I know that the iteration is something that comes up, and that imitation is something that comes up as one of the laws. So how would you prefer to answer this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really when it comes to creativity, it's about the blend of the old and the new. So one of the things that we think when we think of creativity is we think, it's all about radical innovation. But if you actually look at the ideas that have been the most successful, look at the iPad, for example. The iPad was super iterative. So the iPad was an iPhone without a phone, right? The iPhone was an iPod with a phone. The iPod was a better MP3 player. What's funny is that Apple in the early 90s came out the Apple Newton, which was a tablet computer that was just too advanced. It was too unique. It was too different. And if you look at things like Star Wars, right? It's a Western in space. Harry Potter is the most traditional orphan rising story of all time. All of these things that have been really successful usually do a really good job of taking a familiar structure or a baseline or a concept and adding a novel or fresh perspective to it. Right? Think about the Tide pen, right? It's a great example of taking a pre-existing thing and a new sort of delivery mechanism. And we're like, oh, look, that worked. That was a really creative product. It's been a huge commercial success. So I think uniqueness is important to creativity, but I think for a lot of people, they over-rotate on uniqueness versus balancing the familiarity and novelty.
Okay, so I'm going to actually ask that we go back to this idea of community, because one of the things that you talk about in your book is this idea of the clusters. The fact that there's this research that's gone into the most innovative places that there are, you want to be where other creatives are so that you have the ability to build this community. So you have the ability to create more patents and do whatever. Well, obviously, over the past year and a half, we've had a little trouble with this close proximity idea. So, what are your thoughts on when we're geographically challenged and maybe the clusters aren't possible? How do we form community then?
Yeah, so I think this is really interesting. I think I'm a big believer that if you want to be world-class at your creative field, you have to be physically present in whatever the sort of epicenter of your craft is. Not necessarily all the time, but a lot. Now, during COVID, when everyone was remote, I think that was less true. But as the world reopens, inherently, those people who are in entertainment, who are screenwriters, are going to go to parties together. And there is a huge benefit to also being at that party in terms of, if we think about creativity as something that requires other people to teach you, other people to mentor you, other people to boost you and lend you their reputation, having that experience is hugely, hugely valuable. And so I think that, definitely the sort of rise of Zoom and all of these things opens a lot of doors. And I think for a lot of people who just want to be more creative, you can find community online, you can find Facebook groups, you can find associations that have done more digital things. You can do all of that, right? But I think there's never going to be a complete replacement for people who want to be world class, which I, by the way, don't think everyone should aspire to be, because it's a lot of work. You see these stories around, like, Mozart, for example, and that's not necessarily a fun life, right?
It doesn't seem healthy. No.
Yeah, it doesn't seem healthy. So, I don't actually think that's necessarily the goal, but I think it can inform us and give us a North Star saying, okay, if I want to be more creative, yes, community is important. Yes, maybe I don't want to move to Los Angeles, but I should spend more time there. Whatever it is, I think you can use that as a bit of a guidepost in your direction.
Talk to me about, if you would, talk to me about the different roles, the important roles that we have in community, because you actually define a number of important roles that we should be looking for as far as the people that we sort of surround ourselves by. And I think that I think it's interesting to be thinking about sort of proactively, if I want to be more creative, how do I go about, building these communities thoughtfully and purposefully? So what are those roles that we should be looking for?
Great question. So there's a few key roles I think about. The first one is what I call a master teacher. Mm-hmm. So basically, this is one half of what we traditionally call a mentor, and I'll explain the other half in a second. But I don't like the mentor word for a bunch of reasons, one of which I think is not specific enough. Mm-hmm. So a master teacher is a person who was world-class themselves and is teaching the things that they learned to sort of the next generation. And if you look at, there's been a bunch of studies around people who reach world-class levels of excellence. And to a person in these studies, they all had a master teacher. I actually just finished reading Maria Sharapova's memoir, and she had all these coaches who were world-class tennis athletes in their own career, right? This is just a consistent part of the story, is that if you want to be world-class, you have to have world-class teachers. The other half of mentorship, and I like to break out, is what I call prominent promoter. And this is someone who lends you their reputation. And this is really important since creativity is a social phenomenon. If you create something, no one ever sees it, falls flat. Yeah. So as a result, in startups, we have advisory boards. In academia, we have co-authors on papers. In music, we have opening acts. In social media content, we have collabs. Like, whatever it is, what you find in any creative field is that there's a reputation lending where people with more reputation lend it to the next generation and helps them get more recognition and builds them up. So when I think of the word mentorship, it's really those two things. The other two people in a creative community, one is what I call modern muse, which is basically someone who helps inspire you. And a lot of times this is other people in your field. So a lot of comedians hang out with other comedians. And that gives them energy, it gives them some friendly competition. It pushes them to want to try harder, but also they just see more of the world. And the last one is what I call a conflicting collaborator. And so a conflicting collaborator is someone you work with. But the thing that's really important is so many of us, when we pick a partner, whether it's a business partner, whether it's an artistic partner, we pick someone we gel with. But if you look at the most successful creative teams, what they actually are teams where the jigsaw puzzle of strengths and weaknesses fits together. That's where they actually work well. Steve Jobs, weak technical leader. Steve Wozniak, weak seller. Together, Apple computers. And so that idea of finding someone who your actual strengths and weaknesses aren't the same, that conflict is where a lot of the creative magic happens.
I think that, while we're all looking for that creative magic, I mean, it's easier said than done. A lot of times, a lot of the work that people working with associations might look at when they're coming into, say, consult with an association is team building and trying to figure out, like, doing these assessments and personality assessments and, disc profiles and things like this, all so that we can figure out how to create some sort of collaborative team that is more creative in working together. That's all to say that, is it just, if you're the leader of a team, and you're trying to create a more creative team, and you're really looking around. What are some ways that you can maybe apply some of these lessons that you've learned to making your team in like an association more creative?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about, team psychology and team organization all day. I mean, a couple of the key things I think that are important. The biggest one is every study shows us that psychological safety is tied to creativity in teams. Every single study. So the question then is, how do we build psychological safety? The key thing I found is you want to change your team's mindset from our product is the end result to our product is our process. What do I mean by that? Look at Pixar. Pixar has this amazing record of making movies. And what's even cooler is that when Disney acquired them, they kept Pixar and Disney separate, and they took the founders of Pixar and said, hey, come over and implement Pixar's process at Disney. So we had what basically was this massive A/B test. And the result, which was really cool, is that Disney animation became hugely successful. Frozen, all these things. So how do they do it? Well, basically what it comes down to is at Pixar, they view their special sauce not as any individual movie, but as the process they use to make the movies. It's structured, it's formulaic, and over time they improve the structure and they improve the formula. By doing that, what they're able to do is say, okay, if something in this movie didn't work, but we learned something about how to change or improve our framework for how we make movies, it's totally fine. It's not a big deal. That made failure okay because failure became a learning moment. As a result, it built psychological safety, which ties to creativity. And we know it works because if we look at the Disney example, I talk about another example in my book, which is very similar, which is Ben and Jerry's. And I spend a day with the flavor team there, and they're very similar, where they think of their process as their product. They don't think of ice cream as their product. It's their innovation process. That's the real magic of Ben and Jerry's.
I think that, associations could use some magic right now. And we're not just associations, but let's admit it. So there aren't a whole lot of sexy associations. So like innovation's a good thing. When I look at one of the things I loved about your book was that it was such an argument for why I should go ahead and continue hoarding my books and like spending time reading and stuff, because consumption is one of the laws of creativity. And so talk to me about this, because I'm sure it's not just consume everything, right? It's like consuming in a purposeful manner, right?
Yeah. So one of the things I found when I interviewed world-class creatives that was surprising to me was that they were all huge consumers of their niche. So jazz musicians listen to every single jazz record. Writers read tons and tons of books. And the reason it surprised me is that so often I think we think of creativity and consumption as clashing, right? Creators create, consumers consume, active, passive. The reality is far different. The reality is that the best creators, they use a foundation of consumption to inform them as to where an idea falls in the sort of familiarity novelty spectrum, right? Because they're trying to take something familiar and add a novel twist to it. And consuming is what allows them to do that. It's really the fuel for their process. So I was really surprised by, consumption was probably the most surprising thing for me in researching the book, because it feels so contrary to what we think of, where it's creativity is all about doing, but so much of effective creativity is about consuming and letting your right hemisphere do the work it's good at, which is coming up with new and interesting combinations of ideas that you're sort of feeding it. The way I like to put it is that if you want to connect the dots, you have to have the dots to connect. And it's not like going on Twitter. Right. It's not
right.
a little bit about a lot of things. It's going very, very deep in one narrow vertical.
Well, and that actually made me curious about you, because again, like I'm always curious about someone who is pulling together information and figuring out how to tell us all how to do this. What does this mean for how you progress and how you end up applying this? So like, for instance, what are you consuming now?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So, the one part of it is it feels very empowering, because it makes you feel like, okay, well, if there's a field I want to learn, I know how to learn it, right? So it's actually, that feeling is really, it makes you feel powerful in a good way. So right now I'm like semi-secretly, the semi is because I'm mentioning it now, working on a new book. And so for that, it's a different topic than creativity. And so it's something I'm learning about. And so I'm going very, very deep. And so the way I research the first book, the way I'm researching this new secret book is like, I'm reading 10,000 pages of academic research. I'm doing interviews with a lot of academics. I'm interviewing practitioners, going out there, just consuming a huge amount of information. And what I find is that then a lot of the connections between disciplines, a lot of the connections within disciplines sort of become self-evident. And I'm able to sort of connect the dots and build the narrative to be able to explain what I'm finding from doing that consumption. So it becomes a really important part of my process and how I work.
Yeah, that was going to be one of the questions that I asked you was about any future creative efforts regarding future books, because this one, it came out in 2018, I think. So, and I, I follow some of the work that you do. I enjoyed the experiment that you had with being an NFT artist, creator. Like that was pretty amazing. So I'm guessing that that's not your future. You're not going to try to.
No future NFT artist. No. You're going to keep writing books, and that's definitely the thing. I mean, my sort of personal goals are like, I really enjoy writing books around human potential. So how can people unlock their potential? And I think the thing that I find that I both really enjoy and other people seem to enjoy the results of, which is always a good combination, is sort of explaining things that seem unexplainable. And so, my next book is sort of in that same sort of vein of taking something that I think feels unexplainable and explaining it in a way that I think is helpful and actionable.
And that's sparking all kind of curiosity. Is there like a timeline on when you lift the veil so that we can see what that's going to be? I
mean, publishing is slow. I'll probably announce it like next year. So it's it's a slow thing. So
don't hold your breath, basically.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just have to try to read between the lines of things you post and like what you're reading.
You can probably figure it out. Yeah, you can probably figure it out.
Yeah, well, I don't know, because like you post a lot of interesting things. One of the things you posted about was this research that talked about how humans they've identified, I don't know if it was a DNA strand or something like that. There was some particular component that made humans different from other animals, right? And that happened to be a creative element that, was sort of like another argument for the creative curve, saying anyone, this is part of being human, is we have this ability, we can develop this more.
100%.
So, you've got your finger on the pulse of obviously the research and information that's coming out on that. Do you think that there are pieces that you would have included in the book that you would have, that you would include today that you didn't have a chance to include before?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that I was most surprised by after the book coming out was, I would talk to people. They've maybe read the book, they maybe haven't. I would sort of give a talk or whatever, and I was surprised by how deeply. And I talked about this a little in the book, but I think it's bigger than maybe the book gives it sort of credit for. I think there's a lot of like deep-seated negative self-talk and insecurity around creativity that is really, for a lot of people, their biggest obstacle. So you can show them the facts and it helps, but for some people, even with the facts, even with the knowledge, even with the skills, there's still an internal narrative around I'm not creative or I'm too old to learn this skill that people have really deeply internalized. And so I think if I was rewriting the book today, or if I ever did like an updated edition, I would probably have a section on some of the psychology aspects of it. And in particular, how to maybe get over some of that. Like I talk a little bit about one guy who learned the skill of painting when he was older. But I would also like to talk about someone who sort of changed their psychology when they were older. I think that's a really interesting thing to be able to do. And I think it takes a lot of work and intentionality, but I do think it's possible.
Well, I mean, I really hope that we can develop a better skill for painting because I myself am trying to pick this up and I'm starting without a whole lot of talent in that zone. But that's something I recently was trying to do. If you took all of your neuroplasticity tricks and mantras and tools, what kind of advice would you give me on picking up the power of paint so that I would, perhaps not suck forever?
I mean, I think there's a few things. I think one is, one of the things that's hard about building skills as an adult is that, so in video games, the first level is the easiest, right? That's intentional because it gets you sort of going where you're like, oh, this is fun, I'm good. And you sort of, and like a good video game designer is constantly making it just difficult enough to be interesting, but also easy enough that you can master it. Everything else in life is the opposite. Everything else in life, the beginning is the hardest. But we have this faulty notion in our culture of like, find your passion, and passion means the beginning is easy. That is complete baloney. If you look at these people, like I talk about Mozart in the book, I go on a big Mozart rant, but Mozart very early on literally had a helicopter dad who basically forced him to play the piano. And if your dad is sort of giving you conditional love and making you play the piano, you're going to get pretty good at it. And so I think as adults, like we struggle because we get into something and we're like, oh, this is hard. And we don't have a parent or an authority figure to lean on us and essentially pressure us to get through the hard parts. And so I think one of the things that you can do as an adult is try to add in that element of accountability and pressure. So in the book, I talk about this guy, Jonathan Hardesty, who learned how to become a painter as an adult. And one of the things he did is he made a public commitment that he was going to paint every single day and post on this forum the painting. And because he had that public commitment, it helped him actually go and paint every day, right? And so similarly, if you build a network of friends, right? A lot of writers I know have like writing accountability buddies, like I'm going to send you a chapter by Friday, like, and it creates that accountability that makes you just push through a little bit. I think that is really, really helpful. The other things you can do to do that is, create commitment through money, right? So sign up for a really well-respected painting program. And the fact that you spend money, as humans, we have a lot of sunk cost fears, right? So we're like, okay, like I have to go and actually like do this thing. I have to take it seriously. But as adults, we have this great autonomy, but I think that can sometimes serve us poorly because the beginning steps are always the hardest.
Yeah, it's so true. I both love and hate that when I was, I think in high school, I read this thing that talked about an Italian word, sprezzatura. And sprezzatura, it means that it's this ability to do something difficult that you've worked hard at, making it look like it wasn't hard, right? And so there's this idea that, it's like behind the scenes, you're like, there's all these hours that went into it. But what everyone sees is, it's nothing, and then it's just naturally, I don't know why I'm talking like this now, but it's just naturally like you're good at it. And so I always thought, that's the cool way to be, like you just look like you're good at something and you don't show all of the sweat. Yeah. And now I wonder if that didn't hurt me as much as help me, because I think, well, then if it's too hard, you don't want anyone to look at you struggling. You don't want anyone to see the hard parts. It is an excuse to give up, Yeah.
And I think that's the thing is,
like every show, is that struggling or like?
No, it's you doing great. You make it look easy. But yeah, I think that idea of the hard parts, is really valuable and interesting. And the thing we forget is that a lot of times for other people, the hard parts can also even be sort of like hidden. So like for me, for example, with writing, I'd say I really sort of learned how to write when in college. I was a political science major. There was a lot of writing, and then I started writing online columns for a couple different tech, public, and business publications. I did the Next Web, Fast Company. And just going through that over time, I learned how to write. And I wasn't thinking, I'm learning how to write a book. But it turns out a book is just a very long blog post, right? There's no difference, actually. Then it's just a very long version of a blog post. You have to have sort of an intro, a middle, an end. You have to get people to read all the way through. And so, there's this example that's popular in some of the research around development of, you see a girl who's 11, has never run track before. She goes to the track tryouts when she joins middle school, and she's never done it before. And she runs track, and she's faster than any of the other girls. She's amazing. Everyone's like, wow, she's so talented. That's such natural talent. Not realizing that ever since she was 5, her and her dad would play softball in the backyard, and she would be running
Right.
between the trees, sprinting. And so a lot of times, not only do we misunderstand that a lot of times there's parental pressure early involved that leads to skill. A lot of times there's also sort of adjacent skills that make us skillful in other things that are hard to attribute. So there's a lot of misattribution in talent development. But basically what I thought was interesting when I did the research is the most respected and influential academics in talent development think that the idea of natural born talent is basically BS.
Yeah.
It's really surprising. The people who have studied it the most are the ones who most believe that natural born talent isn't a real thing.
Well, can I brag on you for a second? Because here's something that I was really impressed by. I was listening to a couple of other interviews with you, and at the beginning of one of them, the interviewer asked you a question, and you went into talking about how you kind of had some lucky breaks in the beginning. Like there were some things that kind of came together.
Totally.
And what I admire is that, it's not just you're telling everyone like, hey, this is the way to be creative. Anyone can do it and buy my book. It's that you're saying, hey, let me spill the beans on this. If it looks like it's been easy, so I got some, there's interest and talent there, but there's also some lucky breaks, some lucky connections, some things that worked out. And what I like about that is that not just that, it makes you believable, and it makes it like, okay, he's not full of BS and totally self-centered. but it's also it provides hope to people, because the idea is, you know what, it's a number of different elements that come together. Keep working at it, keep doing these things, and by the way, here's a framework for improving these creative efforts and becoming more creative.
100%. And I mean, a couple thoughts there. I mean, one thing I found a lot of creative people I don't really mention in the book, I think at length, and I probably should have, is I was surprised by the amount of projects most creative people have going on at any one time, because they know a lot of them either will fall out along the way or won't work. And so a lot of musicians, you hear about the collaboration they did that really worked, but there are a lot of things that probably didn't work. Take someone really famous, like a Drake or Justin Bieber. There's a bunch of songs he was on that people are like, oh, not good. And so I've always been surprised by that. And for me, it's been a good lesson, because it's reframed when I work on projects now. I always have multiple projects going on. And I know that a bunch of them aren't going to work. So, I mean, this is no one knows this, but I had a TV show in development at one point, did not work. We filmed the pilot, we did not sell it. And the pilot's super embarrassing, I think. But it was super fun and interesting, and it could have worked. And so, you have to sort of view, if you're attempting sort of a creative career, you have to sort of view it as multiple irons in the fire. You don't know exactly which one's going to work, but the fact that you're putting multiple irons in the fire is an intentional act. So that's one thought. The other thought I'd say, which I think is really important, and I think there's a lot more attention paid to this now, I talk about this in the book, but because creative careers are so social, because there's a lot of elements of you need people to sort of lend you their reputation or help you or boost you, it's actually really surprising that a lot of creative industries are actually the least diverse. Because you think about, Hollywood, for example, and you think, oh, well, it's Hollywood, it's progressive, it's liberal, it's all these things. But Hollywood's actually historically been so not diverse. That's why we have
I know, it's
Oscars.
so true.
Yeah, we had Oscars So White and all this stuff, because in creative fields, the social aspect of it is where a lot of the sort of career boosting happens. And people, we know this from research, tend to mentor people who look like them and come from similar backgrounds. That is just what science has found that humans do. And I think obviously one of the negative externalities of that is you have perpetuation of whatever sort of lack of diversity exists. And so one thing I think you're seeing now that's really exciting in creative industries and non-creative industries, I think people are being a lot more intentional about realizing, hey, I probably shouldn't just mentor people who came from the same school as I did, have the same background as me, and look like me. You're on mute.
I was trying to.
I got you.
Thank you. I was trying to keep my coworker, who is a little 8.5-pound poodle, kind of quiet in the background. But no, the thing is I do think that people are being more intentional about it. But obviously, there's still so much more that we can do to try to find that diversity of all kinds of things, even perspectives. I mean, like one of the things that I think gets in the way is when you were talking about like the consumption piece, and you talk about the piece where we're finding people who are these collaborators and stuff. You know, I think that a lot of times when we're going out and we're trying to consume information, we are in the fields, like, let me complete my thought, in the field in which we're trying to improve or, like grow more creative. Sometimes I think that there's this tendency to like feel jealousy or to feel less than. And so we kind of cut out what other people are doing because we view them as competitors. And I know that there's sort of a dance, like you don't want to you don't want to look and see and be too influenced by what the other people in your field are doing. On the other hand, you want to be informed about what they're doing because it's important for you to understand how things are changing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that because of the power of consumption, I think you need to be aware of sort of what others are doing and sort of where there's space and where there is operating room. I think one thing that a lot of people misunderstand, which is a pretty powerful framework once you wrap your head around it, is that typically the places where things are working the best right now in any field are the places where there's not room for new ideas. So a lot of times I do a lot of startup investing. I see it with startups a lot where startups say, wow, this NFT thing is a big deal. So I'm going to go start a new company in the NFT related space. And that's a terrible idea. Because the companies that are big in the NFT space were the companies that 3 years ago were in the NFT space back when it was weird, right? And so often by the time something has reached sort of its like crescendo of awareness, that's usually the time where you have to go, no, like this is too late. But it's a very human dynamic to actually want to pursue that. It's some FOMO orientation, whatever it is. And so one helpful thing for a creative is when you look at and you see what's popular, don't just use that as a data point for your consumption, but also use it as a data point of what not to do. That's where there's not white space. And so I think that's a very helpful heuristic for evaluating ideas is we want to make sure this isn't too on trend because it probably means there's not space for new entrants.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's such a good tip. I think that it's really hard to prioritize because we get overwhelmed with all of the possibilities. We do something like go and make our notes and we say, okay, I'm going to do everything Allen says. I'm going to follow what he's doing. And then we get overwhelmed and we aren't sure, well, what's going to give us the most bang for our buck, time-wise? Where should we spend our energy? What should we build first? So Ken, you talk to me how you sort of make your way through that.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One, I find with creative projects, I find that I can sort of tell when something's hitting, right? And I don't rush to start anything. So I usually let ideas simmer for a long time. So, I have sort of ideas for my next few projects that are sort of simmering and percolating. And part of what I'm sort of testing for is how long do they stay in there? Like, the more I think about them, do I get more excited? Do I get more locked in? So I think one key thing is to not, jump too quickly into a creative project when you have an idea, but rather let it sit there, talk to people about it, like get it out there in the universe and see like how putting it out there and verbalizing it shifts and shapes sort of what you're thinking. And then the other big thing is, understand and learn your own sort of operating rhythm and then sort of build your projects around that to the degree you can. So, for me, I mentioned it's like writing in the morning, it's doing everything else a little more, what's called frenetic in the afternoon. And that's because in the mornings I have like a few hours of focused brain time and I want to use that in really high impact ways. And in the afternoon, I'm still high energy, but I can't focus. So, well, I should do everything else. Like and there's other weird things. So I'll tell you something that people find kind of goofy, but I work on Sundays, usually sort of 9 to 2, sometimes stop earlier, sometimes stop later. But as a result, I sleep in on Wednesday mornings. So I still work on Wednesdays, but I'll sleep till like 10 or 11 because I need a midweek break. Like, I'm just like, I don't have the energy for it. And I like totally get that this is not something a lot of people can do with their jobs. But the reason why I find it's important to call out is that if you have flexibility to whatever degree possible, you need to shift your life to match also your natural body sort of instincts. I get very tired after a few days of not sleeping 9 hours, which is not, you just can't sleep 9 hours really during the week. Like, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so as a result, I sort of need a catch-up day. And so I've built my routines around that, and I've made accommodations like working on Sunday, which for a lot of people is like, what? Why would you work on a Sunday? I'm like, well, actually, because I'm sleeping on Wednesdays. And so you have to be adaptive to your strengths and weaknesses. And I think being intentional about that is really important.
I love that. I think that's a really smart way to go about things, because if you're able to do it, you know, you're figuring out what rhythms work for you best and, you know, what doesn't. And Dan says nap time should be mandatory.
I agree.
Absolutely. I totally agree. I'm all for nap time. Well, you know, so the reason that I asked, it's not the only reason that I asked this about close proximity earlier, but if you want to get to the real root reason that I asked this question about proximity, I recently moved from the DC area to this little town in southern New Jersey, right? Winona, New Jersey. And the idea, it was during COVID, and the idea is like, at this point in my life, I can do most of the work that I do online, all of these different things, but that ability to create community, to create to purposefully go and continue to add to that creative community that I have is something that people both brought up to me beforehand, and they continue to ask me. And the truth is, I've only been here for like 2.5 months. So like, it's too soon for me to be able to say, oh no, everything's been great. I've continued to be completely creative and innovative, and the time away has been good. But for me, I've definitely been looking at it like, well, as things open up, you know, is it going to be monthly trips back to the DC area to have coffee with people? Is it going to be hosting dinners? Is it going to be like, what is going to be the way that I purposefully go about continuing to sort of feed that creative community around me?
Yeah, and I think that's so critical, because I think you're right to be intentional about it. Because I think, you know, what you'll find is, you know, Zooms obviously are better than not doing the Zoom, but it's not as good as that in-person dynamic, right? There's something, and we have a lot of studies about this, but there's something about that body language, that just being present, that makes us feel more connected, that brings us closer. There's something, I think, you know, it's hard on Zoom. I feel like there's some, like, I feel like I need to have an agenda, you know, like,
yeah, me too.
There's something about like getting a coffee where it's like, oh, we're just getting a coffee. Like, let's see what happens. Right. And so I think that's a real thing. And I think what I've seen already as New York starts to reopen is that a lot of my friends who are CEOs who sort of moved out to, whether it's upstate New York or Connecticut or wherever, are finding that they essentially need to spend sort of at least 2 days a week in the city to sort of stay in the flow, is maybe the way I would put it. And I think that makes sense, right? And you could say, you know, 2 days a week, you could say a week a month, whatever it is. But I do think there's an element of, I think with the future of remote work, I think that works really well for a lot of jobs that are not very social. So like think engineering, right? Where there's a lot of asynchronous work that's solo. Even with that, you need some collaboration time, but I think it can work really well. I think for jobs that have a social dynamic to them, then you have to have at least some in-person time. It doesn't have to be a ton, but I think you have to have at least some.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, you know, even when you look at when people connect, you know, online and they connect through social media, and I think about the friends that I've made through the early days of Twitter, you ultimately are trying to figure out, when can we have a drink together? When can we come? Like, when can we meet? When can we get into the same place? Just so we can have that sort of relationship building time. So, you know, I asked you earlier about, you know, a little bit about what you're consuming these days and things like that. But one thing I haven't asked you is a question that I asked the association chat group. And so the association chat community, there's a private Facebook group for them. And every week I ask a different question. Now, this week's question isn't going to work for you because I asked them to share a picture. But last week's question was, can you remember a moment when you were lost in imagination? And can you share that moment with us? So that's really the question for you. Can you remember a moment when you were lost in imagination? Share about it.
Yeah, I can.
Oh, good.
I have like a fun answer though.
Okay.
I've recently gotten really into, I've been spending a lot of time reading and researching hypnosis because I think it's really interesting, and I'm investing in a startup in this space where hypnosis has a lot of clinical research behind it that shows it's really effective for things like depression, anxiety, insomnia, actually chronic pain. Like it's actually like pretty scientifically rigorous. But it has this like weird stigma around it where it's, I think it feels a little taboo. It feels a little like woo woo. But I think in the same way that meditation went from, I think, sort of edgy to very mainstream, I think hypnosis is likely to do the same sort of thing. Again, I know, a little crazy. But so as part of this, I did some hypnosis sessions, and it was really interesting. I did a bunch of hypnosis sessions around sort of like stress and anxiety relief. And one of the things they have you do is sort of think about really happy moments and really calm moments. And I had this like really amazing visualization of this campground I used to go to as a kid that was a really happy place for me. I think I forgot quite how happy I was there, but I had this during the hypnosis session. I had this sort of visual of being back there in this sort of like very happy, joyous place. And if anyone who's listening has ever done hypnosis, the thing which is weird about it is like memories sort of flood back really suddenly that were sort of lost, and like details can be really quite intense. And so it was a really vivid sort of memory of this place that I had spent all this time, and it was a really happy time. And so that was probably a moment most recently where I was lost in imagination because I was literally hypnotized.
You were literally lost. Yeah, right. Well, okay. So if somebody wants to, actually, that makes me want to find out, like, where is a safe place to go for finding out more, finding a good hypnotist or something like that?
Yeah, I don't know if I have great recommendations on actual hypnotists. The app is called Manjit, manjit.com. It's like, go to websites like the self-hypnosis app. And the woman who's like the sort of, if you listen to Headspace, there's Andy from Headspace. Yeah. Manjit is her name. She's the Manjit of Manjit, and she's a well-known hypnotist in New York, and she's sort of the main person. She's like one of the two main people behind this app. So
that is so cool. That's like the best answer yet. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining me today and for talking with me. I have to say that you were just absolutely full of information that was helpful to me, but hopefully helpful to everyone else too. I know that people might have run into some of the work that you did with the American Society of Association Executives recently with their MMC conference, I think. But if anyone wants to really get into understanding more about Allen and the creative curve, he has an awesome website. You have an awesome website. Excellent blog, excellent newsletter, content. I just love all of the content that you share. Follow him on the socials. Buy the book. And then keep your eyes open because, there's more coming along the way. Is there anywhere else that they should check out, Allen?
That was great.
That's
the website has links to everything. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Danielle says, great interview and great presentation at the MMC conference. Yes.
Thanks, Danielle. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Now I was just going to say that somebody else said, yes, naps. So go get more naps.
Literally sign me up anytime.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go check out Manjit. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye.
What did you think? Oh my gosh. I could have talked to him so much longer. I'm sure he's so excited that he didn't have to do that. But I have to say, I had so many more questions. I really held back. But I feel so much smarter having spoken to Allen Gannett today. And I hope you learned something of value today that's going to help you in your life. Listen, there's one thing that we ask you to do every single episode, and that's to keep asking questions to learn every day. Why? Because as Joseph Campbell once said, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Have a great rest of the week, everyone.